5 a.m. While soldiers slept in their bunks, Martha had already started her shift. Her knees ached, her back throbbed, but she never complained. She had left complaining behind in Beirut, 1983. There was no time to complain there, only time to survive. The fluorescent lights hummed above her as she pushed her cleaning cart through the empty corridors of Fort Bragg. The wheels squeaked against the polished marble, a sound she had grown to love over 12 years. It meant she was moving. It meant she was useful. It meant another day of purpose in a life that had seen too much darkness. Martha Jennings was 63 years old, assigned to the janitorial staff at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Her world wasn't tactical briefings or classified missions anymore. It was mops, buckets, industrial cleaning solutions, and endless hallways of marble that needed to shine before the brass arrived each morning. She knew every corner of this base, every crack in the floor, every window that let in the Carolina sunrise. She knew which officers liked their trash emptied before noon and which sergeants spilled coffee on Tuesdays. She knew the rhythm of military life from the outside now, watching it like a passenger on a train she had once conducted. Every day she arrived before dawn, gray hair pulled back tight beneath a faded bandana, uniform worn but pressed with military precision. Old habits died hard. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, invisible to the young soldiers who rushed past her without a glance. Their boots clicked with purpose, their voices carried ambition, their eyes looked forward to careers and deployments and medals. None of them looked down. None of them saw the old woman with the mop. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, someone whose presence registered only when a floor was dirty or a trash can overflowed or a bathroom ran out of paper towels. The contrast was sharp and painful if she let herself feel it. The men and women who ignored her were loud, confident, full of energy and certainty. They were convinced that worth was measured in rank in combat patches, in deployments counted and missions completed. They walked with their chests out and their shoulders back, as if the uniform itself granted them value. Martha was the opposite of everything they represented. Quiet where they were loud, steady where they were restless, humble where they were proud. She never talked about her past because her past was classified, buried in files that no longer existed, erased from databases that had been wiped clean decades ago. She never corrected anyone who dismissed her because correction required explanation, and explanation required truth, and truth was something she had surrendered long ago in exchange for safety. And then there were the scars. Faded burn marks stretched across her left hand, the skin puckered and discolored from wounds that had never fully healed. A barely visible tattoo on her neck hid beneath her collar, its edges blurred by time and sun damage, but still recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. Old wounds that told stories she never shared, stories written in fire and blood and helicopter fuel, stories that ended with body bags and classified reports and a woman who was told to disappear. When soldiers noticed her scars, and some did notice, they assumed kitchen accidents or a rough life before the job. Maybe a house fire, maybe a car crash, maybe the kind of domestic tragedy that befell people who ended up mopping floors in their 60s. No one asked because asking required caring, and caring required seeing, and seeing required acknowledging that the old woman with the mop might be more than she appeared. No one cared enough to make that effort. The first time it happened in the mess hall, Martha told herself it didn't matter. She had survived worse than words. She had survived worse than disrespect. She was mopping near the entrance, working her way methodically from corner to corner, when a group of young lieutenants walked past. They were laughing about something, their conversation loud and careless, their attention fixed on each other rather than their surroundings. One of them, a tall kid with a fresh haircut and an academy ring on his finger, bumped her bucket as he passed. Dirty water splashed across the floor she had just cleaned, gray streaks spreading across the white marble like accusations. The lieutenant didn't stop. He barely glanced back. "Watch it, Grandma," he said over his shoulder, and his friends laughed as they continued toward the serving line. Martha didn't react. She had learned long ago that reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. Reaction meant emotion, and emotion meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness. She simply wrung out her mop, lowered it back to the floor and started again. The same strokes, the same pattern, the same quiet dedication to a task that would be undone by the next careless boot. Silence was her only response. Patience was her only weapon. She had outlasted interrogators in Lebanon. She could outlast a lieutenant with a class ring. It got worse over the following weeks, as if her invisibility had become an invitation. In the administrative building, a captain stopped her in the hallway during her afternoon rounds. He was short, overweight, the kind of officer who compensated for desk duty with excessive authority over anyone he outranked, which in Martha's case meant everyone. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a section of floor that was spotless, gleaming under the overhead lights with the kind of shine that came from years of expertise. Martha looked at the floor. She looked at the captain. She considered, for just a moment, telling him that she had cleaned more blood off more floors than he had ever seen in his comfortable career. Instead, she nodded once. "Yes, sir. I'll take care of it." She knelt down, her knees protesting against the hard marble, and wiped an invisible stain with her rag while the captain watched, arms crossed, smirking at his small exercise of power. When she stood, he was already gone, having lost interest once dominance was established. But his words lingered in the hallway like a bad smell, mixing with the scent of lemon cleaning solution and old pride. This was her routine now. Invisible at best, mocked at worst. She ate lunch alone in a storage closet at the back of Building 7, not because she had to, but because she preferred the silence of mops and brooms to the noise of a mess hall that would never welcome her. She sat on an overturned bucket, unwrapped a sandwich she had made at 4 a.m., and ate in the company of cleaning supplies that asked nothing and judged nothing. Sometimes, in that closet, she allowed herself to remember the helicopter lifting off from the embassy roof, the explosion that turned the sky orange, the screams of men on fire, and the weight of bodies she dragged through wreckage with hands that would never fully heal. 90 Marines had survived that day because she had refused to die, refused to stop, refused to accept that the fire would win. But some things couldn't stay hidden forever. Secrets had a way of surfacing, like bodies in shallow graves, like old photographs in forgotten hallways. The first clue appeared on a Thursday afternoon when a young private named Davis wandered into a restricted hallway he shouldn't have accessed. He was looking for a bathroom, lost in a building he didn't know, pushing through doors that should have been locked. The hallway was dim, neglected, clearly unused for years. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled like old paper and abandonment. On the wall hung a row of photographs, faded behind dirty glass, forgotten by an institution that had moved on to newer wars and newer heroes. Faces from decades past stared out from the frames. Men and women in combat gear, standing in deserts and jungles and ruined cities. Heroes from operations that never made the news, warriors from missions that were never acknowledged. One photograph caught Davis's eye. A young woman in combat gear, standing beside a helicopter engulfed in smoke. Her face was smudged with ash, her eyes hard as iron, her posture radiating the kind of exhaustion that came only from surviving the unsurvivable. She was young in the photo, maybe 25, but her eyes were ancient. The nameplate beneath read, Sergeant First Class M. Jennings, Beirut, 1983. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. Davis squinted at the photograph. Something about those eyes looked familiar. The shape of them. The way they seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. He had seen eyes like that before, recently, somewhere on this base. The second clue came 3 days later in the motor pool. Martha was emptying trash cans during her evening rounds, moving between vehicles with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this task 10,000 times. A technical manual fell from a shelf as she passed, knocked loose by the vibration of her cart. Without thinking, her hand shot out and caught it before it hit the ground. Reflexes that didn't belong to a 63-year-old cleaning lady. She flipped the manual open, her eyes scanning the pages with a speed that suggested comprehension rather than curiosity. Diagrams of weapon systems, tactical formations, communication protocols. Her fingers traced the lines like she was reading music. A staff sergeant nearby noticed. He was working late on a Humvee, hands covered in grease, but his attention had drifted to the old woman with the technical manual. "You understand that stuff?" he asked, half joking, expecting her to laugh off the question. Martha closed the manual and placed it back on the shelf with careful precision, exactly where it belonged. "Just checking if it needed dusting," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, unrevealing, the voice of someone practiced in deflection. But the sergeant saw her eyes in that moment, and what he saw didn't match the uniform she wore. Those weren't the eyes of a cleaning lady. Those were the eyes of someone who had read manuals like this under fire, who had applied this knowledge when lives depended on it. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but Martha was already gone, her cart squeaking down the corridor toward the next trash can. The third clue was the scar itself. One evening, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the medical wing, a young nurse named Rodriguez asked Martha to roll up her sleeve for a routine blood pressure check. It was just a standard screening, required annually for all base employees, nothing remarkable or invasive. Martha hesitated for just a moment, a pause so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed. Then she rolled up her sleeve. The burn marks stretched from her wrist to her elbow, a map of violence written on her skin. But these weren't random marks. They were patterned, systematic, the kind of scars left by burning aviation fuel, by white-hot shrapnel, by a helicopter exploding 10 feet away while you pulled bodies from the wreckage. "My God," the nurse whispered, her professionalism cracking for just a moment. "What happened to you?" Martha rolled her sleeve back down with practiced calm. "Old cooking accident," she said. The lie was smooth, well-rehearsed, delivered with just enough casual dismissal to discourage follow-up questions. "Grease fire. You know how it is. The nurse didn't know how it was, but she recognized a closed door when she saw one, and she had been trained not to push. The blood pressure check continued in silence. These were not accidents. They were not coincidences. They were fragments of a life Martha had never talked about, pieces of a puzzle that was slowly assembling itself whether she wanted it to or not. The soldiers who ignored her saw only mops and buckets and an old woman past her prime. But the ones who looked closer, the ones who paid attention, saw shadows of something else. Something that didn't belong in a janitorial uniform. Something dangerous. Something heroic. Something deliberately hidden. The inspection came without warning on a Tuesday morning in October. General Richard Morrison, for stars gleaming on his shoulder, was making a surprise visit to Fort Bragg. He hadn't been back in 15 years, not since his last command rotation before his promotion to theater operations. His convoy rolled through the main gates at 0800 sharp, black SUVs with tinted windows kicking up dust on the access road. The entire base snapped to attention. Word spread through the buildings like wildfire. The general is here. 4 stars. Surprise inspection. Everyone scrambled. Uniforms were straightened. Boots were buffed. Desks were cleared of anything questionable. The administrative building transformed from functional chaos to polished perfection in minutes. Soldiers lined the corridors of the main hall, uniforms pressed, postures rigid, boots gleaming like mirrors. Every detail was perfect, every regulation followed, every protocol observed, except for one thing. The cleaning cart parked near the east wing entrance. "Someone get that out of here," a major hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes fixed on the approaching entourage. "The general's coming through. Now." A young corporal rushed toward the cart, ready to shove it into the nearest closet, but Martha was already there. She had heard the commotion, understood the panic, and moved to handle her equipment with the quiet efficiency that had defined her work for 12 years. She kept her head down as she pushed the cart aside, her eyes fixed on the floor she had polished that morning. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be seen. She just wanted to finish her shift and go home to her small apartment and her cat and her silence. General Morrison walked the corridor with his entourage trailing behind, a constellation of colonels and majors and aides orbiting his gravitational authority. He was tall, silver-haired, his face weathered by decades of command decisions and sleepless nights. His presence commanded every inch of space, every molecule of air. When he entered a room, the room belonged to him. He shook hands with senior officers, nodded acknowledgement at salutes, made small talk with the precision of a politician and the authority of a warrior. His eyes swept the corridor, taking in details, assessing, evaluating, judging. And then he stopped. His eyes had found something. Someone. A figure pushing a cleaning cart toward a supply closet, trying to disappear into the background. His gaze locked on Martha, on her faded uniform, on the gray hair escaping her bandana, on the burn scars visible below her rolled sleeve, marks that caught the fluorescent light and told a story only he could read, on the ghost of a tattoo at the edge of her collar, barely visible, almost forgotten, but unmistakable to someone who had seen it before. The general's face changed. The political smile vanished. The commander's mask cracked. Recognition flashed across his features like lightning splitting a night sky. "Everyone halt," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The corridor froze. Officers mid-handshake stopped moving. Aides with clipboards stood paralyzed. The young corporal who had been reaching for Martha's cart withdrew his hand as if burned. Confused glances ricocheted through the assembled soldiers. Why had the general stopped? Why was he staring at the cleaning lady? Had she done something wrong? Was there a security breach? General Morrison stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Each boot fall echoed against the marble floor like a heartbeat. His entourage remained frozen behind him, uncertain whether to follow, uncertain what was happening. Martha had stopped moving. Her hands rested on the cart handle, knuckles white. She could feel the general approaching, could hear his boots on the floor she had polished, could sense the weight of history closing in around her like a collapsing tunnel. Slowly, reluctantly, she looked up. Her eyes met his. 40 years dissolved in that moment. 40 years of silence and hiding and pretending to be no one. 40 years of watching young soldiers grow old and old soldiers die and missions fade from classified to forgotten. And then General Richard Morrison, 4-star commander, architect of 3 successful campaigns, advisor to 2 presidents, legend of the modern military, did something no one expected. He knelt. Right there, in the middle of Fort Bragg's most polished corridor, in front of every officer and soldier present, the most powerful man on base lowered himself to one knee before a cleaning lady. The collective intake of breath was audible. Someone dropped a clipboard. It clattered against the marble, the sound obscenely loud in the silence. "Sergeant Jennings," the general said. His voice was thick, heavy with decades of unspoken gratitude. "I thought you were dead." Martha's hands trembled on her mop handle. The mask she had worn for 40 years cracked just slightly, just enough. You were supposed to think that, sir? The general reached up and took her scarred hand in both of his. His grip was firm but gentle, the grip of a man holding something precious. 40 years, he said, shaking his head. 40 years I've carried your face with me. 40 years I've told my children about the woman who saved my life. He paused, composing himself. When he spoke again, his voice was louder, projected for the assembled crowd to hear. October 23, 1983. Beirut, Lebanon. A truck bomb hit the Marine barracks at dawn. 241 American servicemen died in seconds. The largest single-day death toll for the Marines since Iwo Jima. His voice caught. I was supposed to be number 242. The corridor was absolutely silent. Even breathing seemed suspended. My helicopter was lifting off when the secondary explosion hit. Fuel tank ruptured. We went down in flames 50 meters from the burning barracks. I was trapped in the wreckage, my legs pinned, fire everywhere. I made my peace with God in those seconds. I said goodbye to my family in my mind. And then she came. He looked at Martha, his eyes bright with tears he was too proud to shed. This woman, this sergeant, ran into a burning helicopter with nothing but her bare hands and dragged me out. Then she went back. She went back into that fire 7 times. 7 times. She pulled 19 Marines out of that wreckage before the ammunition started cooking off. The young lieutenant who had bumped her bucket stood frozen in the crowd, his face drained of color. The captain who had mocked her about the invisible stain looked like he wanted the earth to open and swallow him whole. The private who had wandered into the restricted hallway finally understood what he had seen in that old photograph. General Morrison continued, his voice steady now, commanding. She was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry, the Bronze Star with valor for heroic service, the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. She was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the mission was classified at the highest levels. Her name was erased from official records. Her service was denied. She was told to disappear. His voice broke on the last word, and she did. She followed orders even when those orders erased her existence. She sacrificed not just her safety in Beirut, but her entire identity afterward. She gave up recognition, honor, a pension, everything she earned because her country asked her to. He rose to his feet, joints protesting, but his bearing remained perfect. He straightened his uniform, brushed imaginary dust from his stars, and then, with crisp precision that hadn't faded in 50 years of service, raised his hand in a salute. Martha stood motionless, her mop still in her hand, 40 years of silence pressing against her chest. Behind the general, a colonel was the first to follow. His hand snapped to his brow with mechanical precision. Then a major. Then a captain. One by one, rank by rank, every officer in that corridor raised their hand in salute. The enlisted soldiers followed. Sergeants and corporals and privates and specialists. The cook who had been walking toward the mess hall. The medic who had stopped to watch. The young lieutenant with the academy ring who had spilled her bucket. His face now streaked with tears he didn't bother to hide. Every single person in that corridor stood at attention and saluted the 63-year-old woman with the mop. Martha's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried since Beirut. Crying was a luxury she had abandoned in the flames, along with everything else soft and vulnerable. Slowly, carefully, she released the mop handle. It clattered against the floor, a sound that echoed like a rifle shot in the perfect silence. She straightened her spine, a movement that came from muscle memory buried deep beneath 12 years of hunching over buckets and pushing carts. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and for the first time since 1983, Sergeant First Class Martha Jennings stood at attention. Then she raised her scarred right hand and returned the salute. The general lowered his hand first. Military protocol. The senior ranking person always initiates and terminates the salute. But this time the protocol felt less like regulation and more like reverence. His voice carried to every corner of that corridor, to every ear straining to hear, to every heart that had been cracked open by what they had witnessed. This woman has served her country in ways most of you will never know and can never imagine. She has bled for it. She has burned for it. She has sacrificed everything for it, including her own name. And for 40 years she has lived in silence, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, receiving nothing. He turned to face the assembled soldiers, his eyes sweeping across ranks that would never look at their cleaning lady the same way again. That ends today. Within hours, the story spread across Fort Bragg like wildfire in dry brush. The cleaning lady who was a war hero, the invisible woman who had saved 19 lives, the ghost who finally stepped into the light. Soldiers who had never spoken to her sought her out to shake her hand. Officers who had walked past her for years lined up to apologize. The mess hall gave her a standing ovation when she came in for dinner, her first meal there in 12 years. The Pentagon was notified. Calls were made to congressional offices and military archives. Classified files were reopened. Bureaucratic machinery that had erased Martha Jennings began the slow process of restoring her. Martha was offered a formal ceremony. Medals presented on stage, cameras flashing, her record declassified and restored before a crowd of dignitaries. The full treatment, the recognition she had earned 40 years ago finally delivered. She declined the stage. "I didn't do it for medals," she told General Morrison in his office that afternoon, sitting in a leather chair that felt too soft after years of overturned buckets. "I didn't do it for recognition or ceremonies or applause. I did it because those boys needed to go home to their families. That's all. That's everything." The general nodded slowly. He understood. He had spent his own career watching men and women sacrifice for reasons that couldn't be pinned to a chest or hung on a wall. "And now?" he asked. "What do you want now?" Martha looked out the window at the base she had cleaned for 12 years, at the soldiers walking between buildings, young and proud and unaware of how fragile everything was, at the flags snapping in the Carolina wind. "Now I'd like to finish my shift, sir. Those floors won't mop themselves." She returned to work the next morning. Same time, same cart, same faded uniform, though someone had quietly left a new one in her locker. Same quiet dedication to a job that most people considered beneath notice. But nothing was the same. Soldiers nodded when she passed, not the dismissive acknowledgement of someone clearing a path, but the respectful recognition of someone worth seeing. Officers held doors open for her and meant it. Young lieutenants who had once looked through her now looked at her with something they hadn't offered before: respect. One morning, about a week after the corridor incident, a fresh-faced private stopped her in the hallway near Building 7. He couldn't have been more than 19, barely old enough to shave, his uniform still stiff with newness. "Ma'am," he said, nervous but sincere, his voice cracking slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you, for what you did, for those Marines, for all of it." Martha smiled. It was the first real smile anyone at Fort Bragg had seen from her in 12 years, and it transformed her face, erasing decades, revealing the young sergeant who had run into fire without hesitation. "Thank me by being worth saving," she said. "Every soldier who comes home should make that trip count. Live your life so that the ones who didn't come home would be proud of what you do with yours." The private nodded, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been purpose. "Yes, ma'am, I will." Martha picked up her mop and continued down the corridor toward the east wing. Behind her, the private stood a little straighter than he had before. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted. He walked toward his next duty station like a man who had been given a mission. That was her legacy now. Not the medals that were finally being processed through official channels. Not the records that were being restored to archives. Not the ceremony she continued to decline. Her legacy was the quiet reminder that heroes don't always wear their honors on their chest. Sometimes they wear them in their scars. Sometimes the most decorated soldier in the room is the one no one sees. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person mopping the floor is the one who saved the world. Moral of the story: true heroes don't seek recognition. They seek purpose. And the greatest honor isn't the medal you receive, but the lives you touch when no one is watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.